Since you're unmuted, would you like to go first?
Sure. Um, I was raised in England on a mixed farm. We had cattle, chickens, and grew a lot of different kind of crops and vegetables. I got a BS in agriculture from the University of Edinburgh in 1967, and I have an MS in poultry science from Virginia Tech in 1972. I started work with Ross Poultry, which was a precursor of the now worldwide Avigen company. Started work with them in 1967 as a management trainee. And after about a year, they sent me to the Netherlands to manage one of the breeding programs they had there. Shortly after that, I left them, about 3 years after that, I left them to go to Virginia Tech. I graduated from Tech in 1972 to become vice president of breeding and production for a new company formed between Ross Poultry and Arbor Acres, which was very well established here in the United States, up in Connecticut. Anyway, I stayed there in Thorntown until 1981, when I started work with Uribred, which is a Dutch company. And I was there till 1989, when I left to go to Maine to work for Avian Farms. And I worked with them until 1998 as their male line geneticist. In 1998, I went to work for Peterson Farms in Decatur, Arkansas. And I lasted a couple of years there, having a little difficulty with my old boss, who was in his late 80s, and he and I had an argument, and he won. Anyway, at that point, I started a company with my partner at that time, Danny Island, and he was located down in Clanton, Alabama, and we formed a company called Rainbow Breeders. And we were actually producing colored birds for the live market here in the United States, basically located in New York and also on the West Coast in California. That lasted about 4 years, and I then returned to work for Mr. Peterson again in Decatur, Arkansas, and stayed with him and then his heir to the company, Blake Evans, until 2017, I guess, and left then to go and work in Colorado for Whiting Farms. And I stayed with Tom Whiting up there for a couple of years, and then returned again to Arkansas, to the same location, same farm, same facilities I'd been for 10, 15 years before. And then I retired from Cook's Venture there in Decatur in 2022, which brings us up to where I am now. And I'm sort of semi-retired, but interested in getting back into the either the consulting or actually breeding meat type chickens. That's my story.
Thanks, Richard. And I'm sure Richard will have a lot more to share as we go on. Anne, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Anne Fanatico, and I'm also located in North Carolina. I'm in Western North Carolina at Appalachian State. I teach sustainable agriculture, sustainable livestock to undergraduates. and also do research on ecological poultry production. Right now, I'm mainly working with ecological feeds for chickens. I do outreach with beginning farmers. And in the past, I have conducted research actually with a lot of Richard's birds. So I've done research with some of the rainbow birds that he and Danny developed. And I did research when I was actually a grad student at University of Arkansas and a program associate, and looked at different breeds, different genetics. I was really interested in the impact on meat quality and sensory analysis. And in Arkansas, I also did work for the National Center for Appropriate Technology for ATRA, and used to put together a lot of materials on poultry for ATRA. And we actually took a fact-finding trip. I got to think, you know, it was probably about 20 years ago, we took a fact-finding trip to France, studying La Belle Rouge, and got to learn about just a lot of incredible genetics that are available. Some of the sasso birds, for example. So I've just got a really strong interest in different types of genetics, and especially in biodiversity, because I teach sustainable ag, and biodiversity is one of the keys. My PhD is in poultry science from the University of Arkansas.
Thanks, Anne. And Mike?
Hey everybody, it's great to be with you all today. My name is Mike Lewis. I am a senior manager in the Sustainable Agriculture and Resilient Communities program at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which Anne just mentioned. Do not have any PhDs in poultry, but have a master's in ecological agrarianism. But my family lives and farms in southeastern Kentucky, right at the western foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, where we operate a small diversified farm. We do with a lot of pastured poultry, both for eggs and meat, and then increasingly more quail and ducks in our operation. And I'm real excited to be here today. Thanks.
And so with that, the first question that I wanted to ask our speakers is just about this, the knowledge in terms of what types of breeds or characteristics should farmers who are looking to do pasture poultry or integrated poultry really prioritize as they're thinking about what kind of chickens should I get for my farm?
I might just start out with something quick there, if that's okay. You know, just the types of genetics you want is, you know, what's really going to fit your system. A lot of us, of course, are doing birds with outdoor access. And I would say Cornish cross, you know, most people actually still raise Cornish cross, whether it's indoor or outdoor, just because the bird grows fast and it's meaty. But I would just like to make the point that biodiversity is important. And so we need to look at a lot of different birds. And I, you know, personally think it's very interesting if your market can bear it. You know, it depends, of course, your system, what you're interested in and what you want to sell to people. But I do encourage people to look at other genetics besides the fast growing Cornish cross. So that does mean looking probably at medium growing genetics, also slow growing genetics, and then also heritage birds.
I'll jump in there, I guess. You know, I think that what you said, Anne, was really important, like what fits in your system, you know, and then also what fits in your market. That's been a big thing for us. We started out with the intent that we were going to raise heritage breeds, and we found that there was a consumer disconnect with what a chicken looked like. You know, the Cornish crosses being big and meaty. and the heritage breeds being a little more lean with a little bit more darker meat. Another big factor that we consider a lot on our farm is climate, right? Our climate's been changing rapidly, and we've seen that we can't support Cornish crosses in a healthy manner the way we used to because of the increase in the humidity and the moisture. So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the biggest things for us was understanding our markets. And then also understanding how we were educating the consumers on why our chickens didn't look like the chickens in the grocery store. But we definitely, in our production system, I want to be clear, my expertise is not merely that of Richard and Ann's, it's just from a practical experience on my farm. But the heritage breeds definitely seem to be a lot hardier. But you also have to, weigh that decision making in versus the cost of production, versus what you're able to sell for. We tried with some of those heritage French breeds that you were talking about, and we just realized that the extra 5 or 6 weeks that it took us to get those to market weight, the consumer market couldn't bear the price point of the increased cost of our production. So I think it is really important to, everybody's going to tell you, not everybody, we're not telling you what type of chicken to raise in your operation, but everybody has an opinion. But I think that if you're just getting started out, the best thing to do is to try a couple different breeds, see what works best for you and what works for your customers, because, that's what's important. And then also, we have some breeds that we have on our farm that we just have because my kids think they're cute and pretty, and I think that's all right too. But yeah, I just, I think it's okay. I want to encourage you to be, flexible in experimenting and finding out what works for you, because what works for me or for Ann or for Richard or anybody else here may not work for you, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. That just means that you have to be ready to adapt and willing to experiment with what you're doing. And again, for context, that's from a producer perspective, not from the expertise that the fellow presenters have.
Well, I tend to agree with a lot of what you said, Mike. My thinking on this, if I was doing it for myself, if I was listening to this our panel here, I would be thinking about, what do I want to do? Do I want to just have a relatively small production, homesteader type of operation, or do I want to sell birds on a regular basis for a profit? If I'm doing it for my family and my loved ones, I wouldn't worry so much about the cost of production. I would be more interested in the health of the birds and what I was feeding them for the health of the consumer. And I'm a big fan of, let's get all these things like glyphosate and other pesticides out of the feed sources that we're using to grow our birds. So I wouldn't care so much if the birds grow a little slower. I would like them to have some flesh on them, unlike most of the heritage breeds that you mentioned that have never been bred for fleshing and meat yield since 1948 or something like that. So those are considerations to begin with. What do you want to do? Do you want to make money at this, or do you want to satisfy your own needs or your community needs in a small way, or smaller volumes? There are some other things that are really important, in my view, and that is not just the genetics, but what about the disease situation with these birds? And the one that's most important for me is mycoplasma. Now, if your suppliers of your broiler chicks can't give you some assurance that your birds are free, or going to be free of mycoplasmas at least at day old, you're in for some trouble with what we used to call chronic respiratory disease. which is caused by Mycoplasma gallisepticum. But there's some other ones like synovia that are involved in that too, Mycoplasma synovia. So all that aside, if you're going to graze these birds outside in the pasture, you want those that are going to be able to forage. Now, if you take something like the Cornish crosses from the major breeders like Carbon and Avigen, you're going to find, particularly on the really fast-growing crosses they have, that the birds are not very mobile, and they're going to sit around, and they're not going to be out there really foraging. And one of the reasons this happens is because those breeding companies have been trying to satisfy their customers that the only thing that they're really interested in, and I'm talking about customers like Tyson and Purdue Farms and those people, those companies, Sanderson Farms and Foster Farms, if you're on the West Coast, what they're interested in is what is the cost of production. In other words, they're talking about growth rate, feed efficiency, and they wanting breast meat yield. What we've done, and I was part of that problem 20 years ago, we focused on those 2 or 3 traits. And the problem when you do that is you kind of concertina all the 3 major growth phases into one operation, or one, they're all overlapping on one another. That's to say that you shouldn't have these birds, or any other animal for that matter, growing too fast to begin with, because what they're doing is they're trying to develop a skeleton that's going to be rigid enough to carry weight. So they develop their skeleton first, along with their internal organs. Then they should be developing musculature at the middle phase, which actually is a really rapid part of their growth. If you look at it on a chart, on a graph perspective, and then finally they lay down fat and stop growing, basically. That's what's normal. But we've just put, in the last 50 years, we've put all those things into just a very short period of time. So you've got birds trying to put muscle on a flexible frame. So you don't have proper joint formation and development. So the birds become lame. That's the real, try to give you a picture of what really happens biologically when you have these types of selection programs with very, very intense selection pressures. Because the chicken is such that you can only need to keep 1 out of 100 of the males and about 5 out of 100 of the females to get to the next generation. And I've skipped around a little bit here, but the birds, basically what you're looking for is acceptable traits, or acceptable performance for traits like feed conversion ratio, growth rate, and WOG yield, in other words, carcass yield. And it does depend on just exactly what you want to do with your bird, with your production. And it's important to describe that in detail before you get started on one of these projects. I'll be more than happy to answer more questions about that later if I've omitted a bunch of stuff that people are interested in.
What are some breeds, or are there certain breeds that are more or less appropriate for farmers in the different regions or climate types in the United States? And what are some maybe examples of those?
I'll start out with that one again, just to give kind of a quick overview. What's funny is birds used to be bred to fit environments. And that's why you do see a lot of birds with names that are geographical names, like like the Wyandotte, from the Northeast, with turkeys, the Narragansett. So, 40 years ago, chickens used to be bred to fit particular environments in particular regions. So we don't have that anymore. It's interesting to start looking at, can we have that again? And it's something I would really be thrilled about, because I believe our agriculture, our animals, and our crops, should be adapted to the regions. So, the Wyandotte, for example, has a small comb. Some birds with the larger combs, of course, are going to be like, meat birds or dual purpose. The Dominique, it has really one of the few breeds that were bred for the South, for warm regions. It has a bigger comb to be able to dissipate heat from a hot area.
Well, there's definitely a need, I think, in the South to have a bird that can cope with the heat. I've talked to some folks from Arkansas a couple of weeks ago, and they're having problems with birds, fast-growing birds, not able to keep up in the summertime when the temperatures are high, to the point where the farmers are unable to get in as many crops of production. They want to have 8 or 9 crops a year, and they can't do it because their brooding facilities are not empty fast enough for them to put in the next flock. And so they're ending up with only being able to do maybe 7 flocks or 8 flocks perhaps per year, and their farmers are saying, well, we can't continue to do this. We're not making enough money to make it worthwhile. So that's where I think something like the naked neck gene needs to be put into some of these breeds. And we did that when I was working at Peterson Farms and Crystal Lake Farms. And those birds are actually able to stand about at least 5 to 10 degrees higher outdoor temperatures than birds that are fully feathered. They also have some other advantages in that they have a pretty robust immune system, and they have a lot less fat in the carcass.
Yeah, and I think, it's, it's okay to experiment too, right? I mean, that's how we sort of landed with the meat variety that we're currently raising on our farm. We, instead of going out when we started out, we went out and bought, the 250 birds and put them on pasture. But after a couple of years of making some mistakes and seeing the birds struggle in our climate, we got a little bit smarter, and instead of ordering 250 birds of one breed, we ordered 25 birds of 10 breeds, and we sort of watched them and tracked them over time. And over a 2-year period, we were to decide that it was pretty easy for us to decide that this is the breed that works for us in our meat production systems. So I would just say that don't expect that you're going to find the answer to what breed is going to work for you right away, and be flexible in that, and be willing to try a couple different breeds to find what works for you. It took us 3 years to really decide that. I mean, I hate to tell people what I raise, because I think they're going to run out and grab it and think it's going to work for them. But our primary meat bird on our operation is the Kosher King. And it works really well for us. It does well in the heat. We're able to get them to market weight in about 10, 11 weeks. But it took us being willing to try and being willing to make mistakes, which, mistakes are the keys to success are found in the mistakes that we make. So, be willing to experiment. Our laying hens are, we started out with golden comets, like, red stars, and we realized pretty quickly that wasn't going to work for us because of a few different factors. And so we sort of, actually, I mean, I'm not a breeding expert like Richard, but now we've got some local breeds from some local farmers in the Appalachian Mountains, and we've started crossbreeding them. And we started out with non-commercial white leghorns, and we started introducing some of the other local buckeye breeds that farmers have been raising around us for a long time. And I couldn't even tell you what breed our laying hens are right now. I can tell you that they produce about 20% less of a yield than the red stars or the golden comets that we had initially, but they require about 40% less in terms of input, and they do a lot better on pasture. And they don't require a lot of effort from us. If one of our pens of 50 chickens, if they break out, I don't really care. The only thing that bothers me is I got to go find the eggs. Thankfully, I have 2 kids, and you give them a basket, because they're going to fend for themselves and they're going to take care of themselves. So, I mean, be ready to experiment and try things. I mean, it's actually a lot of fun. I mean, it gets very frustrating because you're going to make mistakes, but like I said, that's where you find success, is in trying different things and seeing what's going to work. Because even in my region, I can go 4 haulers over. If you're familiar with what a hauler is, I can go over 4 haulers, and there's a vast difference in the microclimate. And the farmers 2 counties over can't raise kosher kings, but we can. So, be willing to adapt and be willing to try out different things to find what works best for you.
That's a great insight, and that kind of leads me to my next question. As you're talking about trying things and observing the birds to see what the mistakes were, could you maybe go into a little bit about what are the things that have not worked for the birds? What are some of the kind of the undesirable traits that you didn't expect to see with them? And also, I think it leads to the next question of, what does it take? People are wondering to start to breed your own flock, like you've both talked about.
I guess things that don't work is I personally I don't like to see a bird that doesn't fit its environment. It just makes me sad. I think it's upsetting to see a fast-growing bird suffering in a hot climate. The poor bird's breathing so hard. You just hate to see that. I also don't like CITES, so you do see that sometimes, with fast-growing meat birds. So there's, I'd say, a lot of things that don't work. I mean, I'm not a breeder. End user use the birds, but I imagine breeders find lots of things that don't work, and it's the mistakes that you learn from.
Well, I certainly know quite a bit about ascites. I think I kind of invented it. What happens if you select too intensely for fleshing, without regard to the frame size of the bird, what happens is the birds are actually become pretty well handicapped with regard to being able to breathe properly. And I don't know whether you all know this, but chickens don't have a diaphragm. So the only way that air can get drawn through their lungs is by the expansion of their body cavity with using the keel and the ribs and so on to create negative pressure. And then fresh air, we hope it's fresh, with plenty of oxygen in it, can go drawn into the lungs. And when you've got these little compact birds that have a high appetite, so they've got a tremendous amount of feed that they're going to ingest. And so it fills up their body cavity so that there's no way it can actually breathe properly. And that's particularly important in hot weather, because that's the way they cool themselves, is with a high rate of respiration. So yes, that's one of the problems that I encountered back in the late 70s and early 80s in my breeding programs that I was working with. Yes, so we need to have birds that are, I think, better focused on where they're going to be growing and where their traits need to fit the climate. And there are other things that are important in certain areas. If you put some of these birds into some areas, they won't adapt to that climate. But if you're breeding the bird in that area, it will automatically, through epigenetics, modify its DNA so that it better fits that locality where it's being bred. So I think we're going to return to some of that in the future, because epigenetics is has quite an impact on performance.
And so I do believe that, and you sent me some slides that kind of address the next part of this question, which is, how does one do it, or how do we go about starting to start their own flocks and try to do this on their own?
If you pull up the last slide of the set that I sent you, I've tried to write down some of the things that Richard has explained to me about a three-way cross. And this is, of course, breeding your own. We can definitely talk about places to buy pretty exciting birds. And I've seen, Mike answered that he gets his kosher cross from Freedom Rangers. Freedom Rangers has an excellent selection of birds, many different types. But one thing that, I've actually have gotten from talking to Richard more recently is that, just the focus on duo purpose is a fascinating focus, instead of just for meat production or just for eggs, is looking at birds that can do both. And they don't do both as well as, a fast growing, bird or high laying chicken would do. But this is something that communities can keep going. And actually the slide before this, I actually call it community breeding. I just don't really know a word for it, because we talk about community gardening, and all kinds of community work. So I just called it community breeding because it's a lot of work to do on your own. And so, most of us are interested in local community-based agriculture. So Richard, I'll turn this over to you, because I've just tried to write down your notes about how to do this.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Thank you for putting together the nice chart so it keeps me on track too. Well, what the idea was in having two primary breeding programs, one for the male side and male attributes, and one for the female side and their attributes. Because typically what major breeders do is they have a different kind of a three-way cross. But it involves three pure breeding lines, which actually is more expensive than just having two pure lines. It's 1/3 more expensive at least. But anyway, what this proposal was, and actually we did it at one time, Danny Island and I did this back in 2000. We had the same kind of setup. So the male line was where the meat and the growth rate and all those genetics were. And on the female side, that's where we had all the egg production and fertility and hatchability and all of those traits were located. And what we did is we took the males from the female side and mated them to the females of the male line in order to produce the BA that you see down here cross. And that BA product is actually, well, the males are byproduct, so you can grow them out for meat and so on. But the females over here on the right, those are the ones that are going to have reasonably good egg production to produce the baby chicks for the commercial baby chicks. The males, on the other hand, are the A times A, and they stay as a pure breed. And down here, at the very end of it, those males from the A line are mated on the females that have the BA genetics. And the reason I wanted to do it with using the male of the female line is because many of the genes involved in egg production efficiency are located on the sex chromosome. And the way this is set up, the BA females will all have their sex chromosome from their sire, from the male. And so they're more likely to lay more eggs than if I'd done it the other way around. So anyway, that's the way this particular cross setup works.
And Elisa in the audience asked a good question. They asked, so is the point of this that we're better off breeding or crossbreeding our own chickens, or would you recommend that that's not necessarily the best option for everybody?
I would think that, you know, I mean, it's a lot of work to be a primary breeder. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I think Richard has said there's only 2 primary breeders that provide all the fast-growing birds for the world. Aviagen, and what's the other one, Richard?
Cobb Vantress.
Right, Cobb and Aviagen provide all the birds for the world. So to me, it's important that we start doing this again in some way. So I would say, you know, we just need to see, and you know, it's a lot for one person to reinvent this wheel, but like I say, I think we can do it in communities. But there's certainly some excellent hatcheries to choose from. You know, I just put together that quick slide deck that you saw, that Faye showed. You know, I do have a couple hatcheries listed on there. I think we need a good ongoing list of hatcheries. I used to have quite a list, and this is just, you know, maybe NCAT, you know, can renew keeping up with this type of list of where to get some of these incredible birds from. I mean, I saw Mike listed the Livestock Breeds Conservancy, but you know, Freedom Rangers does have Sasso, has Kosher King. I don't know if can you back up one, Faye, and back up. Let's go to this. Okay, yeah, that one that shows the 4 females across the way. Yeah, so here's an example of working with Hubbard, and you know, Richard would have to tell you which company. I think Aviagen owns Hubbard now. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Because
Yes,
they've all consolidated. So these were females here in Canada, you know, that Hubbard used to work with. I'm sure still works with, you know, the Red Bro female, the Red Bro mini, and then the JA57. These are all female birds. And next slide, please. You can put different males onto these females. So here's some naked necks. You know, you can, it's just fascinating, you know, all the different types of males. You can use a fast growing male, a medium growing, or a slow growing male. Next slide. So these types of birds exist, and you can get a lot of them, for example, through Freedom Ranger. But I do think, you know, at the same time, we need to focus on our heritage breeds, you know, U.S. heritage breeds, like the New Hampshire, like the Delaware, because of course, you know, the king of chicken is the Poulet de Bresse that many of us have heard about from France, and it's incredible genetics, and it's also specialty finished with actually finished with some milk products. Next slide. So I think, you know, using these hatcheries, McMurray has the enhanced Delaware that Richard's very familiar with from his Colorado work. So I think we just have to do it all at the same time. You know, some people will want to buy specialty birds. Some people will be perfectly happy with the fast growing Cornish cross. But again, I just want to say the main thing is diversity. You know, diversity is nature's immune system, and that's what it's going to help protect us all from things like avian influenza, the chickens too. So I think, you know, working in community, and you can stop the share now, but I just wanted to say I do have, you know, a few things put together if it's helpful for people. So it's a long answer to say I think we need to do both. I think we need to use know about what we're getting from our hatcheries, and most hatcheries will tell you now, even if it's a Ross, even if it's a Cobb, you want to know what you're getting, and then us working intentionally together with you know, people that can help consult with our breeding programs.
Yeah, and I feel like it's important now that Ann and Richard have been talking about, clarify a little bit what I talk about when I say we've been breeding our laying hens. I am not nearly as scientific minded as Ann and Richard, and our breeding program is, you know, 20 or 30 of our favorite hens running around the yard with a rooster, and us collecting the babies when they start running across the lawn in the spring and summer. So I'm not nearly as scientific about that, but so I just wanted to throw that out there, because I feel like when you guys started talking, I feel like you guys were talking about breeding in a different context than I am. You know, I'm not nearly as scientific. We just look for happy, healthy birds, and those are the ones we save back, and we just mix them back up. We're very very liberal with our breeding. But what has happened over the last 3 or 4 years is we have a good flock of hens that are sort of native to our climate, and you know, they're not in pens. The ones that we breed with, they're out in the woods and in the trees, and hopefully the dogs protect them. And when a clutch hatches, we run and chase them and put them in a pen with the mother and let them get big, and then we sort of decide if we're going to sell them or move them on, or what we're going to do. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because I said I was breeding chickens, and then you guys talked about breeding chickens, and I realized that I was a bit of a hack, at breeding chickens. So I just want to provide that context. So if you have specific questions about breeding chickens, you're probably better going to Ann or Richard than me, because I'm very much a trial and error sort of guy. So I just wanted to provide that context.
Mike, don't shoot yourself down like that, because I want to read you something that I was getting ready to write and put into a book that I plan to put together before I die. But embarking on your own chicken breed might sound like an enormous undertaking. However, we should bear in mind that humans have been breeding chickens and other animals for their own needs for thousands of years. They accomplished this without the aid of computers or the knowledge of scientists such as Charles Darwin, Gregor Mendel, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The strategy of mating the best to the best will produce more of the best is still the basis of present-day complex and costly breeding programs. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I just got a self-esteem boost.
And I think we need to bear that in mind, because it's not that complicated when you keep it in those sort of simple terms. The only thing that I would guard against when you do start out is that you have a reasonably good number of birds in each generation that you're going to use to give you the next generation. In other words, you do need to avoid things like inbreeding, depression. And one of the rules of thumb that I have from a friend of mine is always maintain at least 15 females and 15 males to reproduce the next generation. Otherwise, you may run into some inbreeding problems, like hatchability and livability and so on.
That's great, Richard and Mike. And I think hearing from your book is a great way to kind of end the questions from me and to wrap up this panel.